other, they'll get written up in some form. But I'd like to do something on the website and certainly something for the network. But there was one comment overall, because it's written by itself on one bit of paper, it's the easiest to refer to. How can artists build communities and inspire us to break the chains of extractivist systems? So, which is a very good question to ask, and each table yesterday, for those who weren't here, was asked to come up with a question overall. My response is, and one of the comments that was being made was that there wasn't an experts and artists, we're all experts. And in my view, we are all experts together. And as soon as we start to think of artists as a separate community, I can see the validity of that, and I can see why it's important to maintain that. But in some ways, it's not the healthiest way to operate. In my view, artists and us who are not artists, but who are artfully minded, are part of a similar community and need to be. If we're going to create cultural change, it will not be done by one faction alone. It has to be, and art, as long as art has existed, it's been part of a community. I don't think there's an artist in history that has just made work without it being seen, shown, made by someone else, with materials made by someone else, sourced from somewhere else. And art is a community practice of itself. And I'm an art historian and a medievalist from a time when art was part of everyday life and part of community in a very much bigger way. Different kinds of communities, of course, and much more belief-centered, authoritarian beliefs. Anyway, that's a whole other issue. But if we, and that's why really I wanted to form Groundwork Network, partly because there was such a great community of artists that had formed through the residency programme. But it was a community that was also helped and cemented by the wider community around of people with different aspects of knowledge. And the polarization of art and sciences, I think, is deeply unhealthy, and that point has been made many, many times. And there are a lot of artists now that also study science. As long as we think of these silos of activity, we won't change society. We have to bring us together to create a wider culture. And I'm a great believer in culture in the widest sense. The minute we talk about culture as a thing, again, it's being siloed, and there's the risk that it's being put on a different kind of pedestal from people in everyday life. And I've learnt a lot of this by being a gallery on the high street, and having being part. I'm on the BID board, the Business Improvement District board, and it's been fascinating to see the town and the businesses in the town taking risks, and that I'm accepted as one of them because of that wider context. And I've learnt more about that than I ever learnt in a university gallery. I've learnt more about teaching than I ever learnt running an education department, because there are people with their own knowledge and their own experience and their own enthusiasm out in the streets we have to talk to. And there are also many who won't be interested and say it's not for me, in which case there's no point in hammering away at it, except I believe there is, because I've found that people will come in and say, look at the Richard Long, say, did the builders throw the coffee on the wall? And that's the start of a really fruitful conversation. And often I've found people have been regular users since then, because it's broken some kind of barrier. So we all know there are many barriers to break, but as long as we silo ourselves as particular practitioners, they will continue. And I really believe we should be together as a wider community of knowledge. And there are different knowledges that have to be interrelating with one another. That's my little homily for the morning. And I hope there will continue to be fruitful discussions, and that everyone has expertise. And what you've also shown through the residency programme is how everyone has hung on to their own specialism and knowledge and expertise, but developed it hugely. There's not been anybody who's been involved directly in the residency, who's made the same work they've been making before. Everyone has opened up in different ways. And I think it is, and a lot of you have said this, through being part of a wider community together. So let's hope we can continue with that. And thank you very much to my colleagues at Broomhill, Helen, who's chairing this morning, and John and Nicola from the Grange at Great Cressingham. Nicola was part of the community of artists too, so they played an extra role this year. But many thanks to them for being part of it. So I'm now going to pass over to Henry, who's going to put on the film. No, I can put on the film. So now our first contribution is being made by Bridget Mackenzie, who a lot of you met yesterday. She couldn't be here today, but she is here in spirit and on film. So press once again.
Hello, I'm Bridget Mackenzie. I'm very happy to be here virtually, and I'm very sorry that I'm not there in person. I'm going to be talking about what kind of power does art have in the face of the Earth crisis. And I'll refer a bit to my work in Culture Declares Emergency and Climate Museum UK. And I'll be really talking about why is the Earth crisis a disruption nexus or an opportunity for cultural change? What has art and culture got to do with this? And I'll be arguing for an increase in artful practice or artfulness. So the Earth crisis is a disruption nexus, and this term originates from Roman Krzyżaniak, who wrote a book called History for Tomorrow. It's the point when the normal starts to become impossible, when our survival depends on drastic changes that we must imagine and enact. Why do I call it the Earth crisis? Well, some people call it the meta crisis or the poly crisis, but I feel that we need to have the word Earth rooted in there, in that phrase, because all major current problems arise from harmful exploitative relationships to biological life, which includes humans, and they arise from the disregard for the vulnerability of the Earth's operating systems. So boiling it down to key causes, they are the emissions from fossil fuels and many other pollutants, the destruction of carbon sinks, intense development and consumerism, and all part of that, increased social inequality that rests on centuries of colonialism. So it is, it's a historical story, it's a cultural story. Our culture has been sustained by a stable homeostatic state, but Earth now isn't absorbing CO2 at the rate that we're emitting it, and that's never before happened. So we're now at the stage where we're seeing potential tipping points unfolding, and we are in overshoot. So in this state of breached planetary boundaries, the priority is collective safety, and we have to shift our focus from slow mitigation to actually dealing with the impacts in ways that stop harm too. So this is about overcoming that binary between mitigation and adaptation. And it's also about overcoming our divisions and separations. So is this the time to come together in places? Politicians, citizens, creative people, the vulnerable, to ask what must we do for all people and species to be safe and resilient? And although I emphasize that we should use the term Earth crisis, I do believe that climate change is the threat multiplier. Its breaching matters more than the others because it worsens all the others. And so really our mission now is about being collapse responsive. And that means that we have to embark on a deep and drastic process of truth-telling, caretaking, and change-making. That might mean creating islands of sanity to prefigure alternative ways to live. But essentially, it means that we should be driven by the goal to change systems so that we can regenerate and sustain life. We should always be asking, what can I do to ensure the continuity of conditions for biodiverse life and humanity on this planet? Culture has many, many roles in response to this collapsing and breached critical situation. It can be an expression of life at the heart of a more regenerative system. If you're in the cultural sector, you can work and make art for truth and care and change. And this diagram here, it shows you on the left, the triple bottom line, the standard model of sustainability with 3 pillars of economy, environment, and society. And culture is nowhere in that frame because it's seen to serve the economy with commodities and also to put sticking plasters on the harm that that system does. But we need to move to perhaps an ancient notion of culture for life, which is about healing and regenerating and life honouring. And a movement that I helped found, which I hope has that goal, is Culture Declares Emergency. It's not about just declaring and then signing a register and then doing nothing. It's about forming communities in order to, work hard for justice, to hold each other to account, to move towards regenerative change, to take care of your cultural practice, your communities, and so much more. We're putting action into creative practice and culture into environmental activism. So we're really trying to, again, bridge those boundaries. I've developed a toolkit, and that includes a blueprint for change that, again, has these 3 pillars or areas of truth-telling, caretaking, and change-making. The very first suggested activity is to declare emergency. That isn't something that you do at the very end of a process after 5 years of wrangling about whether your reputation can stand making a declaration. It's the first thing that you do. And then you start to reflect on responsibilities, auditing, reprioritizing your values, planning to adapt to shocks, aiming for not just a reduced harm footprint, but nurturing a positive handprint. And that really is where the role of arts and culture comes in. So there's much more, again, on that slide, deepening relationships with community and having a longer term, bigger picture impact. So in order to really experiment with and explore what this means in practice, I've also founded Climate Museum UK. It's a group of artists, designers, educators who help people make sense of environmental issues through creative conversations and activations. So we don't hold exhibitions, we don't have a venue to do that. We run pop-ups and workshops in museums, in outdoor sites and community settings. There's some overlap with the Groundwork Collective, people like Jamie Jackson and James Aldridge. I'm just going to talk a bit about some of the local or face-to-place work that I do under the umbrella of Climate Museum UK. How I moved back to Norwich just over 2 years ago, and I set up this thing called Positopia Norwich. And through this, I run a whole range of community creative activations, such as Writing the River to Life, which is coming up soon for Lost Species Day. Reimagining the City was a creative assembly with Culture Declares East. And we've been doing some environmental history workshops, working for the Norwich Science Festival. On Wednesday, I ran a workshop that was really about being inspired by the radical heritage of Norwich, the radical characters such as Amelia Opie, who was an anti-slavery campaigner. So we incarnated these characters from the past and used this kind of framework to be able to understand what are the impacts of ecological overshoot and social shortfall. What can we do at this disruption nexus, this moment of change, to create a livable, survivable future? And crucially, at the end, the participants all together wrote a history, imagining what a future historian would write about what we did at this moment in 2024 to make a change so that we could create a city of innovation and stories and thrivability. So that workshop template is an example of something that I have fed into my book, which is called Earth Talk. It's about engaging people with the Earth crisis. And there's about 128 activities in there, or tools or models or resources. And this is an online community. At the heart of the book and the course is this framework of narrative design for engaging people with the Earth crisis. And it's all about integrating feeling, thinking, and doing, because so many activities that you might find, they're either far too emotion focused and they don't enable people to take action, or they're far too logical and scientific and they don't engage with people's emotions, or they're far too focused on just imagining a beautiful future without really accepting the realities of where we are, or they just jump to action and then that action is not sustained. So how do we integrate all of these things in our neighborhoods or in our curriculums so that people are able to loop around these activities and keep reinforcing their ability to take action? And moving on now to the value of culture. And people might say, we need more art, we need to defend art. And this talk, of course, is about the power of art, but I think it needs to be framed in the bigger picture of culture. Culture is underfunded and it can be defensive and insular. And within it as well, you get sort of infighting about the value of various parts of it. But I would argue that all parts of it can be more artful, and that is the value of culture. In environmental circles, art can sometimes be seen as too linked with capitalism or elitism, so it can be avoided or attacked even, and just sort of sidelined for work that they might call creativity or imagination. When it is acknowledged, it's often in narrow terms of the inner work or the emotional dimension. But let's really see the breadth of potential for culture with artfulness generating it. I really was helped to understand that I needed to return to my own personal art practice. And that was by, the associates in Climate Museum, people like Jamie and James, who are very inspiring. And so I'm doing an art course in Norwich 1 day a week, and that's really helping me. It's helping me see how important it is to make space for being artful for yourself and for others. We can't create a regenerative culture without being generative ourselves. People seem to think that art is just about the inner work, but I argue it integrates the inner and the outer. It's active and reflective. It's concrete and symbolic. It's bridging the individual and the collective, just to bridge from that inner spiral to this outer array of pathways for outer action. These also bridge and stop binary arguments between the individual and the collective. These are all ways that we can take action individually as people that can actually create a systemic change. So I'm just going to conclude by talking about how artful practice can help us integrate the inner and outer with this model that I've taken from the work of Giles Hutchins. He has written a piece very recently about how we need to support people to move from fearful reactivity through to courageous co-creativity, which leads to a culture of responsive reciprocity, which then leads to systems that are more fit for the future, more resilient for the shocks that are coming. And you can see this kind of cycles around. I've done this diagram to show that cycling, but essentially we need to, see that life is less about reacting to outer change and more about an inner outer dance with change. And I just like that as a place to finish, that perhaps being more artful is about this inner outer dance with change, and we need to embrace that, embrace our inner and outer adaptiveness. So thank you for listening, and I hope the rest of your day goes well.
Hello everyone. Well, I'll say thank you to Bridget, even though she's not here to hear it, but I think we can still do that. So my name's Helen Lindsay. I'm going to chair the next session. For those who don't know, I've got 18 acres in Norfolk of wetland, grassland, woodland, and I've just been thinking about this idea of fragmentation and the way in which artists over this residency and the other ones have love fragments of things, love bits and pieces, and imaginatively fill in the gaps or creatively transform fragments, but actually building on what Veronica was saying first thing, in other areas of our life, we have to get away from fragmentation. We have to pull together ecologically, and in terms of activism, we need to, not work in fragments. We need to actually create links, and that's what we're doing here today. So that's brilliant. Harry, is Harry here? Harry, hello, Harry. I didn't see you right at the back. So. I will move the... So Harry's going to set the scene for the morning. Harry's family owns Wild Ken Hill, which makes my 18 acres look like a postage stamp. And he's going to talk about managing the land in the face of multiple challenges. Thank you, Harry.
Well, thank you. I am Harry Buskell, and I am one of the partners of Wild Ken Hill, which is just down the road from here, 20 minutes away. And in 10 minutes, I'm going to talk to you about managing the land in the face of multiple challenges, which is an absolutely massive topic. And so in 10 minutes, I can only give you an impressionistic overview of that, and I will almost certainly leave out some things which might be dear to some of your hearts, so forgive me if that is the case. And it is indeed true that we are in an environment where I think if you are responsible for managing land, you are faced by multiple challenges, because we are at a point where we are moving from a system which has really been in place since the end of the Second World War, which was based upon extraction from nature and productivity gains, to one where we need to get much smarter and work with nature in an inclusive fashion to answer some really complex questions about our land priorities, what should go where. We need space for nature and climate. They're two sides of the same coin. We need to produce nutrient-dense food in sustainable quantities, and we need to be able to provide people with space and access to nature. So those are complex questions, and it's just worth a recap, perhaps very briefly, on how we've got here. I've tended no longer to read articles in The Guardian about what's going wrong with the climate, because it makes me not want to do anything, and I'm trying to be focused entirely on doing things. But so apologies for the slight re-going over areas which are a bit depressing at best, but nonetheless are reality. So in the, you'll probably be aware of something called the Green Revolution, which really came into effect in the late 50s and early 60s, which was a technological revolution in the agricultural industry, whereby there were massive gains in seed technology, which allowed yield gains, particularly in things like wheat and rice. Pesticides were introduced, mechanization of agriculture, irrigation, and chemical-based fertilizers became increasingly available to farmers around the world, and sort of answered the Malthusian question of how we're going to feed billions of people. And, it has been a miracle in one sense, because, we are now feeding the thick end of 8 billion people globally. And it was a simple time to be a farmer, because that's what your job was. It was to produce food and to be productive, and it sort of leveraged even more by joining the Common Agricultural Policy in 1973, when farmers were awarded subsidies for crop prices, and then subsequently simply, if you manage an area of land, well, you just got a payment for doing that. So it was a fairly singular approach without a great deal of complexity. But as we all know so well, the bill has well and truly arrived for those decades, and agriculture globally is literally killing us. And biodiversity decline is well rehearsed, I know, but just, a benchmark of farm species in the UK is down by more than 50% between 1970 and today, bearing in mind that the benchmark in 1970 would have been an awful lot lower than it would have been in 1939. Agriculture is a really shocking greenhouse gas emitter. GDP, anyone got any idea what UK agriculture produces as a percentage of our GDP?
Less than 10%.
It's actually 0.6. And has anyone got any idea what percentage of our greenhouse gas emissions UK agriculture is? It's 11. So for approximately 1 unit of production, you're getting 17, 18 of greenhouse gas emissions. So it's the worst polluter after the energy industry. So we've got biodiversity decline, we've got climate issues. We've lost the integrity of our soils. I'm sure you'll notice when you go for walks in Norfolk or drive down small lanes, there's a lot of sand nowadays in the middle of the road often, or at the sides. That was your topsoil. As we've lost the organic matter and the structure of the soil is becoming much, much more like dirt. And so that's a challenge we need to face, and then we need to think about the type of food we're producing, because we have very high protein diets, and I'm sorry, just sort of audience participation. Has anyone got any idea how much of our land area, arable land area, is used to grow food to feed animals? Yeah. Yeah, it's 40. And we use 2.5% of our land area, 133,000 hectares, to grow crops that go into biofuel. So types of food we're eating is also making us ill, as we know. And I'm sorry to say that farmers are notorious for complaining about everything, but they actually don't make much money. And there was a survey out this week which DEFRA produce annually. It's this survey of income, annual farmers' income, and something like a third of farmers make less than £25,000 a year. And a tractor nowadays costs about £200,000. So that's a sort of litany of misery I've given you. But it is sort of what people are looking at. And I'm bearing in mind that the average age of farmers in this country is 59, 60. So most of the people who are running the land in this country learnt their stuff at agricultural college in the mid-1980s, when the Green Revolution and crop incentive mantra was at its absolute height. And so for them, changing culturally is hard when they're suddenly learning that everything they've been told was a good thing to do was not. And they've actually done a fair old amount of damage. So if that's some sort of macro context in a really rushed way, I can tell you at a micro level how we've been thinking about it at Wild Ken Hill, and what we're trying to do about it. So we got our heads together in sort of 2017 and 18, and we had a kind of a think about, well, what should land management look like in the 21st century, so that we can try and think about how can we grow nutrient-dense food in sustainable quantities. How can we recover biodiversity? How can we be good citizens for climate change? Provide green space for nature, for people to access nature, and then face the reality that a lot of these things aren't going to happen unless we engage with capitalism and private markets and the savings markets. And so that's led us to do a few things in our land area. And I think we were early adopters doing these actions, which have now become more commonplace. But back in 2019, when we started, they were quite innovative. So we have we have rewilded about a quarter of our land area. So we have where we have soils which are low yielding, very sandy, or very heavy clay. We've let nature take its course effectively. That's what rewilding is. And we've reintroduced species into that area, including beavers and grasshoppers, which are nearly extinct, and hopefully natterjack toads. And we've tried to reintroduce white-tailed eagles. So rewilding gets you carbon sequestration and it gets you biodiversity recovery. We do lots of measuring, so we've got the science to be able to demonstrate that this works. They've just finished a big report at NEP in conjunction with Oxford University that rewilding systems are probably storing an additional 5 tons of carbon per hectare per annum. We do a lot of traditional conservation. Traditional conservation is what you might think of as where you're intervening quite actively to manage land holdings, like wetland management. You're fiddling around with water levels and grass levels and targeting specific species, but you want to try and do it really well. And we're trying to make sure that we have a lot of traditional conservation, pollen and nectar mixes, and similar beneficial areas within our farmed area. So there's a congruence between where we're farming and where we have nature all around it. And most importantly of all, and I think most excitingly, we are working hard on recovering the soil biome. We've lost the ecology of our soil over the last 50 years. There should be, in a healthy soil system, a symbiotic relationship between the plant and the soil, because the soil has should have billions of creatures in it, and when its ecology is complete, and those creatures are providing the plant and its root mass with all of the nutrients, minerals, nitrogen that it needs, and the plant in return gives those creatures simple sugars through photosynthesis. And we've lost a lot of those creatures, and we're working very hard through learning with American universities and to replace that biology, and through making vast amounts of compost and applying it to the land. And the good thing is that it works, and you get all of the oranges in the fruit machine come up, because on the farm you go from carbon emissions to carbon sequestration. So an average farm is probably emitting 3 tons of carbon per hectare per annum. So with our regenerative farming approach, we're now storing net carbon per annum. You get a fantastic biodiversity recovery on your farm almost immediately in terms of insects. We haven't actually used insecticides for 15 years, but you do get a massive recovery in insect life, and therefore all of the biodiversity that springs from that, and you're growing more nutrient-dense food. So that's 3 ticks in the box, and so it does work. And then we're providing significant amounts of availability for really anyone who's interested to come and access Wild Ken Hill to explore whatever they're interested in, whether they are artists or they're interested in fungi or dragonflies. We have multiple education visits, forest schools, numerous visits from other farmers, and wildlife trusts, and so on. So this is a hopeful thing. We've done the gloom, but it does work, and we just need to proselytize it and spread it to others. And I think the encouraging thing is that is starting to happen, because soil 5 years ago wasn't a word you would have heard mentioned at any agricultural conference. Maybe that's a bit unfair, maybe 7 years ago. But now it is the thing that everyone is talking about. Some of you might have heard of big agricultural event that happens in Hertfordshire every year called Groundswell. It's a regenerative farming conference. It started with very small numbers of people attending. There are now probably 7. It's a 2-day event, and I think there are 7,000 or 8,000 farmers there on the 2 days, including some now I see who I've only ever had in the pedal to the metal full extraction bucket. So that's very encouraging. And although DEFRA, our guiding ministry, has been pretty slow in coming up with the environmental land management scheme, which is what farmers now operate under in terms of getting money out of the government, the policies which they have developed are really, I think, now starting to focus quite nicely on soil recovery and understanding that we need large areas given over to nature which connect up. And so I, for example, am working on something called a landscape recovery scheme, which is where you get farmers collaborating together to put significant areas of land together for nature. And so there are 6 of these schemes in Norfolk, and they are more or less contiguous. So anyone who might drive from Kings Lynn to Hunstanton, next time you do, we're working on a scheme which involves all of the land on the left-hand side of the road to really make that over into a large area for nature. And if we can pull it off over the next 20 years, that will really be a fantastic enhancement to our local biodiversity. So there we go. I think that's probably enough. Is that okay?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you, Harry. It's a lot to think about, but hold those thoughts. Okay, so we next have Sarah Trillo, who's a Margate-based artist, and she's going to be talking about molehill. Thanks.
Hello, everyone. Harry's talk's a really neat fit into moles, although I have to say I don't know a huge amount about moles. I came to Norfolk expecting to investigate chalk mines. My research for the last 3 years has been into Dean holes, which are holes in the ground dug since pre-Roman period for the excavation of chalk to put on the soil to marl. That's the theory. And I thought I'd come to Norfolk and investigate the subterranean chalk tunnels below Norwich, and I'd look at Grimes graves, which are the Neolithic, I'm sure you all know them, Neolithic flint mines. So they're chalk mines where flint was extracted by our ancestors to use the flint for knapping. And you can see the map on the right is from 1761, and I think it has about 25 pits from Grimes graves marked on it as circles. So I thought, how do I deal with this interest in a very short period? I had sort of 6 days of residency, and I thought, I need to dig. I need to understand the mentality of ancient excavators. And my very generous hosts, Nicola and John at the Grange, said I could dig a hole in their garden. But I thought, actually, when they alerted me to the molehills, I thought maybe it'd be easier to work with the molehills that are already existing there. And mouldy warp is the Old English for mole, which is literally earth tosser. So I sort of began to learn about moles. And the first thing I did was identify a sequence. There's lots of molehills at the Grange. I identified a sequence of 21. So I kind of had this map of Grimes graves, which is inaccurate in my head. And I started off by outlining all the molehills I could see, and I used scraps of fabric I'd brought with me, sewed them together, and you can see on the left-hand image this kind of mapping of these molehills. You can see this map on the left that I've got 2A, 2B, 2C. The moles, in between me doing this first mapping, they made more molehills. So I was kind of, the moles were working with me. And what I then did was I gently excavated the spoil from the molehills. I collected it all in a garden sack. And then I decided to try and locate the sort of shafts that they had come up from, where the molehill spoil had been. And I found that I made some improvised clay tools in situ, but I didn't fire them. But I liked the fragility of them. I thought they'd be very gentle to excavate with the sort of being sensitive to the moles. But they all broke. So I ended up using this roe deer antler that I had brought with me, which I really liked because it was in the spirit of Grimes Graves, excavators who use big red deer antlers. And I found that this is a very good tool for sort of picking at the molehills. And I found these sort of central little shafts, so let's call them mine shafts for the moles. And then when I squeezed myself Alice in Wonderland, like trying to lie on the ground and put fingers in these shafts, I found that from these central shafts, there were little tunnels going off them. So the whole experience, well, first of all, I want to say, it sort of reminded me of these secret tunnels in Norwich. I was entering this hidden subterranean world. And because the sort of project went off at a slight tangent, I hadn't brought sort of cameras to put down the holes, but you can see on the left, this is me dropping my phone down to try and see one of these side tunnels, which I discovered these tunnels are where moles hope to lure earthworms. So when the earthworm comes down, they can smell it, and they immediately go and they either kill the earthworm or they paralyse it, and they store the earthworms in special larders. And the researchers have found up to 1,000 earthworms in a mole larder, but I didn't find a mole larder, unfortunately. But so I was sort of putting my fingers in really gently, and the whole thing was very haptic. I was sort of caressing and touching these tunnels. They're very, very smooth and beautifully made. If you've worked with clay, it was kind of like leather hard clay, it's very sensual. And then just to sort of use the ground in a different way, I very gently threaded a string through all these sort of tunnel traps that I could interconnect. There was a sort of run of 6 tunnels that I could interconnect. And then I put these improvised grills over the top. So you can see on the right, these kind of grills, they're made with unfired clay, which I'd taken with me. Dean holes and other pits are often capped with bat grills, and they become bat hibernation sites. So I wanted to sort of honour that tradition as well that happens in the 21st century. And I'm glad I did leave them as sort of open grills, because when I went the next morning, the moles had filled them with soil again, so I'd sort of tossed all this soil out. So I did feel like it was a sort of 2-clawed mole gesture from them at me to sort of leave them alone. But anyway, so just to say, so this is the sort of work I ended up making. So as I said, I collected all the spoil from the molehills. And if you look at this structure at the bottom, it's got 6 sections. They're the sort of 6 molehill spoil holes that I managed to connect with interconnecting tunnels, the earthworm trap layer. And the one on the left has got 3 pieces of plastic. That's all that came out of the spoil, because I panned it. So you can see my sort of the fired clay sieves that I made as part of this. The second hole has got ceramic shard fragments, mostly brick. And it was really lovely. I worked with an archaeologist for a day who was a friend of John and Nicola's, and he said it was all mostly 18th, 19th century ceramic shards. The third section's got organic matter like wood, nuts. And then the fourth section's got stones, and then the fifth section's got flint, and the last section's got chalk. And chalk and flint were the predominant things I found, which made me really happy, because that's what I'd hoped to sort of find in Norfolk. And then you can see the improvised tools that I've made. Again, all out of this clay, which it's the clay I took with me, and it fires black, which again felt in the spirit of this sort of subterranean experience and working in the dark. Like the moles can see, but they only really respond to light. So I felt like I was working the same way as them, and it's very intuitive. And I used flint in some of the tools from the John Lord napping day. And I think the last thing I will say is, while I was doing this research, I found out that the English Heritage have a lot of sites that are owned by landowners or farmers, and they're not allowed to disturb the soil. And obviously moles don't respect this law, so moles are digging on this land. And there's a site near Hadrian's Wall called Epiarchum, which was a Roman fort. And English Heritage drafted in 37 volunteers to sieve all the molehills, to pan them. And they found like Roman jet beads and shards and bronze dolphin fountain sections, and really amazing things that the moles have thrown up that they haven't been allowed to dig. So this is my last day. I didn't get any treasures in that, but I still kept stalking all the Grange molehills. And this 20th century marble is my most significant find to date. So thank you, moles, and thank you for listening.
Made me think. I wish we could talk to the moles and find out what they thought. Anyway, Sarah Hollock is going to be our next. She's a Norwich-based ceramicist.
Right. As we've said, I'm a ceramic artist and a landscape archaeologist. Unsurprisingly, my work is inspired by archaeological landscapes and processes. The meanings and narratives of objects and places is also central to my work. The residency kind of took me in several directions, but they were all predominantly to do with flint mining. One of these directions was looking at the ecological impact of flint mining in the Brecks, more specifically looking at the Grimesgrave site that Sarah's just talked about, and looking at how the vast quantities of chalk that were brought up to the surface have really altered the ecosystem. In fact, the Clean Rivers Trust described Grimesgraves as the first landscape of contamination. But in this case, the contamination has allowed, over time and with stewardship, has allowed a really rich, diverse kind of habitat of chalk-loving plants, more akin to a sheltered chalkland, set within this kind of area of acidic grasslands, heaths and plantations that are more akin to Breckland. And it kind of does possibly raise some questions about the really extensive other areas of flint mining that are known to still exist within Breckland, often under the plantations, and whether through similar stewardship, other kind of really rich, diverse chalk flora could be encouraged. But the work I'm going to talk about most today is my kind of more archaeological approach on the residency, but I'm going to try not to talk too much about archaeology because I will run out of time. And again, this is the one that was kind of probably more influenced by the residency. We've all seen lots of images of the wonderful Watson Stone collection at the Sedgwick and the amazing kind of displays of fossils. It really struck me when we were on the tour that this material told stories of kind of geological time and origin, but also stories of the history, the politics, and the aesthetics of its collection, its study, and its display. Equally, the exceptional Castle Rising Church that Tim took us to, which did you describe yesterday as a visual and chemical poetry? Again, looking at this material, it kind of showed us how one facade of the church or even one block of the stone brought together all these different temporalities of geological origin, phases of extraction, reuse of historic material, but also these kind of social statements to do with architecture and style and status. So this kind of extracted material is kind of able to embody both geological and social time together. So this kind of connected with some research that I'd been doing at the Grimesgraves archive at the Museum of Anthropology and Archaeology in Cambridge. And I kind of wanted to look at how those sorts of sites, the flint mining sites, kind of embody all these layers of time, of place, and of people. So kind of taking a slightly similar approach to Sarah, but we kind of came up with these ideas completely separately. I looked at kind of excavating down. So I excavated down into chalk blocks using flint tools I'd created on the residency, kind of going further and further, and then pouring liquid clay slip into these extractions. The slip casting created kind of a record of the extractive event, but also a kind of moment in time, a moment of destruction and creation. I made these slip casts kind of as thin as I thought I could get away with, so they were really fragile, and that fragility kind of had a material connection with the vulnerability and the destruction of the extracted landscape. Some of the pieces were unfired, others were glazed in the interior with a kind of a flint-like surface, And this kind of talked to me about the tension between natural and cultural, and also kind of interior and exterior worlds and ways of thinking. The chalk acted as a really sensitive carving and casting medium. It really retained the lines of the marks of making, these like wonderful striations and horizons, and the liquid clay, the slip, kind of held on to the powdery chalk surface and the minerals within it. What I was going to say. I had a go at sort of slip casting into actual sea urchin shells to create little ceramic casts, and it was really amazing the amount of detail that you could get. And these are all things that I've never done before. And it was a real exercise in kind of letting go of control, because it was all really unpredictable and quite often unrepeatable. So that kind of appealed to me because it's very different to how I normally work. The final piece was sort of an attempt to look at all these different layers of time, from the long durée of geological time and deep time of kind of mythology and ancestral understandings of the land, right through to the kind of a split-second moment, kind of whacking a bit of flint with a hammerstone, or those amazing Neolithic thumbprints that have been preserved in the chalk and clay slurry on the antler picks. So I tried to look at all these different layers of time. I have waffled at length on my website about all of them if people are interested. One of the ones that probably had the biggest connection to the residency again was this piece, this component of it that looked at familial and sort of generational time. Spending time with the flint napper John Lord and also his son on the residency. Also, Tamlin Lundberg, who's not here today, another ceramicist, we went and bothered the flint team at Caister Chalk Quarry near Norwich. The Hunt family makes up sort of quite a big part of the flint team there. So along with the quite detailed historical research into the post-medieval gunflint industry in Brecon, centred on Brandon, we know that sort of generation after generation of particular families were working in the kind of getting of flint and the working of flint. I know James mentioned chalk being in your blood yesterday, but flint was very much in people's blood and their lungs. And so this is a flint core, a kind of byproduct of the post-medieval flint industry that I picked up at Flint Hall, which is one of the sites owned by a flint master bought in the 1790s, where he built napping sheds and workers' cottages on the land. I've inscribed it with some of the names of the flint napping families, those families where generation after generation worked in the trade. Inside, there are some gunflint waste, some post-medieval flakes that had been used next to Flint Hall to kind of bulk up the road surface. So it's, Brandon, the fabric of Brandon, the architecture of Brandon and the landscape is kind of, the flint waste from the post-medieval industry is kind of everywhere. It's part, it's a real part of the architecture and the culture. Don't change slides. So the installation kind of looked at the geology of my own working practice. I had sedimentary sequences of my clay waste. I also tried to I fired some of my slip casting waste, which was kind of a nod to the napping waste that was structurally redeposited within the prehistoric mines as part of closing ceremonies. Both of the pieces had sort of chalk blocks from the actual mines at Grimes Graves, which again was a reference to the chalk and flint altars used within the mines, where sort of important cultural objects, ceramics, tools, things brought into the mines kind of made sort of ritual gestures and had a dialogue between the sort of relationship of people and place, and also the architecture of extraction. So this brings me to my last point. Archaeology kind of attempts, archaeology does scientifically and objectively record the past. But when we are writing archaeology, when we're thinking about the past, it's really sort of reflexive and creative, just like art. We all bring ourselves to it. I think we're looking for versions of ourselves in the past and sort of our present and our possible futures as much as we are sort of looking at the past. Each generation brings their own agendas to these theories. It's not surprising that recently someone's offered an interpretation of Seahenge as being a response to climate change. Definitely the last point. So one of the things that really struck me with Grimes Graves is that mine is the first step in this kind of accelerating, kind of increasingly voracious taking of the Earth's resources for industry, including creative industry. But those first steps were done with such kind of reverence and ritual and respect. And this idea that they were taking something really special from the Earth was sort of really key to how people responded to it. I think there's probably a lesson for us all there.
Thanks very much. Now we have Nicola, who many of you, of course, know from the Grange, but also is a renowned academic and graphic artist. And she's going to talk about cultured land.
Thank you. Hi. My interest is in people and the position of the arts in society and how we understand different arts and the arts more widely, so media and popular culture. My original degree in the 80s was in social anthropology, so I guess at that point I was introduced to a few isms and which have stayed with me. But I then, during the 90s, set myself up as a self-taught illustrator. So again, my background and my work has been about an interest in communicating ideas which developed into comics. I think that we learn or we understand quite complex ideas, either personal or about the human experience through the visual and through popular culture and storytelling in that way. Or certainly I do. And I think for me, I've put these words educate, entertain and empower, because I think that's for me in what I do is when it's interesting to try and communicate. So in particular, I'm an advocate for the comics form within that. And by comics, I'm going to I have a very loose definition of a combination of text and image. And the reason why is several reasons, really. I really enjoy the immediacy of the form. So it's something we all know how to do a comic. We know how to engage with comics, and we can also make them. You know, stick figures are very easy. We all can go back to our childhood to remember that. I also really like the history of comics as a lowly art form. It's not an elitist form. It's got a history of being used with a very illiterate population in this country. That's how it emerged. And what that does for me, it feels like a democratic form. We respond to the comic in this country in terms of it's for children or it's something a light form. And so once we've got the viewer there, we can introduce more complex ideas. So that's why the comics. And I think that these comics particularly are useful in activism as a tool, not the only one, but as a tool in activist activity or campaigns, whatever that might be, whatever that form that might be, and also from a grassroots, because it's just paper and pencil, it's a very accessible form as well. Really, I hope I've converted you all now. And I was thinking of grassroots and that bottom-up approach, so my title for the project that I did for the residency, or as a result, was called Bottom Up, and I like this language. But before I continue, I just want to give you the evidence for my what I'm saying about the comics, how great it is. So My PhD was in gender studies, and I looked at, it started as I entered the comics community in the UK and was making comics, long form comics. I was, of course, became aware of the history of comics is masculine and still is quite so now. And why was that? And I was looking, I came across the feminist literature, and I was thinking, well, actually, this is how comics, how women came into this field of comic making. And so this is an example of the women's suffrage campaign in the UK. My research, and so the reason I want to tell you about this feminist campaign is because we talked about this idea of hope, and things can change, and it might be over time, but the things that we as women today take for granted, you know, when the suffragettes were around, was really not taken for granted. So let me think. I just want to tell you about the context for this poster. So I was very excited to call this a comic by the suffragettes. And I just want to remind you of the context that this was used, because if you Google suffragette cartoons, you get this huge pages and pages of cartoons that were being put out by men cartoonists at the time, anti-suffrage. So suffrage was such a huge threat. And they all visually relied on the stereotype of women as too ugly or too old to get married, therefore they became suffragettes. And so what was interesting is the suffrage approach to humour and to cartooning was actually pointing out the absurdity of the system at the time, and I think that's interesting. So my own particular research looked from the 70s, but did trace the visual back to the women's suffrage movement, which in 1903, formalised by Emmeline Pankhurst, was about the women's struggle for the right to vote and stand for government office in Britain, begun much earlier in the mid-18th century. And just to give you what this is about, in 1909, a collective of London-based women artists and illustrators who studied at Slade School of Art formed the Suffrage Atelier. They used cheap, low-tech screen printing as a technique to promote the cause of women's suffrages at rallies and in the suffragette newspaper. So my point is that this activity was grassroots, or it was a bottom-up. Although they were from a privileged strand of society, they were still doing it themselves. We might say they were just fucking doing it. So again, I like this approach, and I traced it throughout the 70s, 80s, and now this is people and women just making stuff to support their message. All right, next slide. So it's this approach that I saw in the Wild Ken Hill project, literally in the approach to soil management. And inspired, I was attempting, I'm not sure how successful I've been, but I was attempting to make this a metaphor for the soil of how we are in society, this top-down and bottom-up approach. So in traditional or top-down approach to farming, Harry reminded us the traditional approach in farming, as you touched on a little today, is about clearing the earth and applying from above. There's pesticides, there's fertilizers, the chemicals, and then clearing it and starting again. Whereas a more bottom-up approach might be starting with what you have, and I think with what the regenerative farming of Wild Ken Hill project is about, letting the roots stay. And I was thinking of the language we use, this grassroots approach to activism. And we can see it in society, particularly in education, but also in the public arts sector, this clearing what we've got away and starting again from the top. This is what good art is be. This is what education is, rather than leaving what we have and building on it. And I think my point about the traditional is, and back to my interest in people and how we as together operate, is this it's supported by this neoliberal ideology of the individual, and it's creating us as these isolated, unhappy people, when actually, the idea of diversity and coming together and working together is much more, makes us happy, and it's about well-being. So this is the bottom-up approach. 1 minute, thank you. And just finally, why the Ken Hill project? I particularly like the regenerative farming approach, because when Harry's talking a little bit, it's not about ignoring the capitalist system we're in. It's about how do we feed the population? And I really liked that approach, that when we visited Wild Ken Hill, Harry was saying, we had to scale up our experiments that were great, but they were too slow, because that's the business of farming. And so what I did as well for the show was this cartography, which is a Turkish fold, where I tried to give an idea of what Wild Ken Hill was about. And why that? Because they'd asked me, Colossive Press is a couple who set up this micro publishing from their front room, and they invited me a year ago to do something for them. So this is number 59 in series 10, and I love their approach, because they're just fucking doing it, and they have day jobs, but they're really passionate. So this weekend they're at a big comics festival with their range, and they collaborate with the artist, and they sell them at £2. £1 they keep, £1 goes to the artist. So it's using capitalism, but it's also and it's a lovely platform and a conversation to promote ideas. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicola. Next up, we have Julia Giles, who's an artist based in Cornwall who works in relationship between the landscape and the human. She's going to talk about ancient vegetation traces.
I like mentioning ancient.
That's your title.
Thank you. Thanks, Helen. Right, hi everybody, I'm Julia, and I was on the residency this summer, based at Broom Hill, staying at Helen's Place in Reefham there. And so just to introduce myself briefly and put my practice in context, I live on a farm in West Cornwall, where I grew up and where I worked before I went to art school way back in the 1980s. At that time I trained as a painter and a printmaker, but over the years I've also used video and photography and installation, and most recently, like many artists I'm hearing, using found objects in my work, found objects I've found in the land. So choice of media depends on the line of inquiry that I'm making, and probably because where I've come from, as Helen's just indicated, my work has always been about the land. Even when I lived in London for over 30 years, it was still always about the land. So as you have heard from the others, on the residency, we visited an incredibly rich variety of places to gather material, and guided by really incredibly knowledgeable experts who told us a lot of things, which was a lot to take in. It was a very intense week, and it was amazing. So we gathered all this for our projects in response to the brief, extraction. So I just want to focus on two places which provided the starting point for a piece of work that is currently in the gallery there at Groundwork. The first place was at Middleton Aggregates, particularly the clay quarry, which you can see there on the left. There's the kind of cliffside of clay, and there's a digger thing in the background there, and there's lots of digging going on there. And the other place is at the wetland at Reefham. There we go, on the right, particularly with the horsetail plants, which you can see in the foreground just there. Now, this horsetail plant, this is the ancient vegetation, which is in the programme. The programme refers to that. I should be telling you about ancient vegetation. I have to confess that I don't know much at all about ancient vegetation or plants, but and this will be the only one that I'm looking at today. But what drew me to it is the structure of it, the look of it. They're notched segments, and they're sort of lovely radials. If you look there, you can see, this kind of circular shape they make. I really just like the look of it, but aside from just the look of it, It's the fact that the antecedents of these plants were around before the dinosaurs. That's an incredible amount of time, obviously. I'll leave the horsetail plant for a second to look at the fossil on the right there. There you see it. You can. It's an imprint of an ammonite which was found at the clay quarry at Middleton Aggregates, and I think what's he called yesterday? Peter Lemon told us how everybody was so excited about finding so many fossils there. The place was alive with fossils. We found many fossils. Talking of living fossils on the left, so there's one of the things about Peter gave me that fossil, and I was very excited to have it. I just love its fragility, the lines, the irregular spiral shape that it makes, the thin lines, the thick lines. It was a beautiful thing, very fragile. And also the fact that it was a trace of something that lived such a long time ago. And I think, for me, one of the things that struck me with such force on the residency was the unimaginably vast periods of time traversed in the geological history of some of the places we visited, just inconceivably huge periods of time. And as mentioned, what I found particularly interesting about the horsetail was that they were around, these plants like this were around when that was crawling around. And it was just amazing to think that such a plant, its descendant had survived through all these millennia. And that was, this scale of time was, I found awesome. And yes, as I've mentioned, I think when I Googled it and found that horsetail plants are sometimes known as living fossils. So, it's got a great heritage. It's very ancient. And looking at these two images side by side there, I'm sure you'll have noticed something of a similarity in their shapes. That's the circular, the spiral sort of shape, the fine lines, the radials. And so I wanted to make something tangible to connect these two organisms across those countless millennia. And so using the spiral as a motif, I tried to replicate the shape of the fossil using dried stalks from last year's growth of the horsetail plant. So you can see there's the horsetail stalks on the right. And I tried a few times in the week 2 of the residency, when after we'd collected our stuff and we were trying to make things in that second week. So I tried a few times, and the first things initially it just looked a bit like a target or a dartboard or something. It didn't work at all. So I thought, why aren't I getting this? And it was what I made initially. It certainly didn't evoke a fossil. So to make me look more closely, and I think somebody mentioned drawing yesterday, to make me really sort of get into that structure and really understand it, I made several small drawings of the fossil, one of which is there on the left, you see. And then when I began to draw it and really look at it and spend time making these little drawings, I saw where I was going wrong. There were thick lines, thin lines, all kinds of irregularities. And with that in mind, the later ones that I made, I thought were a bit more successful. Anyway, to return to the brief, aside from finding this fossil in a clay quarry, how does all this relate to our theme of extraction? Well, as mentioned, I was excited by the vast periods of geological time and the fact that this particular species of plant had survived, reflecting the shape of other ancient organisms. And for me, this brought up the question of, what's going to survive into the far future from our current era? Is something going to make it that long through that amount of time? Is it even going to make it to the 22nd century? So with that in mind, I made another piece with found objects from the quarries and from the wetland. I went around with my metal detector and found strange things underneath. I didn't rely on moles. That would have been more fun. Well, anyway, I was also digging things up using this little metal detector there. And I made another thing called the Anthropocene torso, made of an old grill rack that I found, and a toxic spray can filled with paint and messages on the back saying danger, danger. And so I made this thing into that's at the gallery. Anyway, so the theme arising from the residency that I want to continue working with is not so much about what we're extracting from the soil, but what we're leaving in it. It's not about finding ancient patterns in specific organisms, but looking at the ancient networks, and they've been mentioned today, that still support and sustains our soil, and the damage and disruption we're causing to it. On our visit to Wild Ken Hill, Harry told us about how 20th century agricultural practice has diminished the structure and health of our soil, and the work they're doing there to restore it. So there's not just bad stuff going in the soil. There's actually, there is some hope here. There's some good stuff going in the soil, and that's what we need to work on. So since then, since hearing about things going on at Wild Ken Hall, and also, living through my own farming background, which is nothing like what's going on there, I'm sad to say. Thank you. I've been learning about the mycorrhizal network, and this must have come up when we were at Wild Ken Hill. So it's this network, the mycorrhizal network, is about the way that fungal organisms and root systems in the soil connect with each other through chemical messaging to communicate deficiencies and send support to each other. Now, I know I'm probably huge. I'm oversimplifying here, but what we know is traditional ploughing does massive damage to these networks. And it's not just the ploughing, the deep ploughing, it's the stuff we put into the soil, the chemical fertilizers, the pesticides, all those things. They're killing those microorganisms that Harry mentioned. And they're destroying the mycorrhizal network. And without those networks, without those things, as he also already mentioned, topsoil is being washed away. Flooding is more likely. This has also been mentioned today. So this last slide here shows some work in progress since the residency that I've been doing, thinking about this network, the soil, the washing away of the soil, the integrity of the soil and how we're damaging it. And what we got here is, both are monoprints made from a mud-soaked polythene bag I found in a potato field. The one on the left has plastic, it's baler twine, left over from some harvest 2 or 3 years ago, no doubt, embedded in it, breaking the root network, which I've painted in white there. So that's is to evoke the mycorrhizal system. There's plastic in there, winding itself between there and getting in the way. It's breaking the root network, which is painted there. So that's where I've got to in terms of issues and themes to think about following the residency. That's to say, what will survive into the far future from our current era? And as well as what we're extracting from the soil, what are we leaving in it, positively as well as negatively? Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Julia. So the last in the current morning 10-minute talks, we've got Lydia Halcrow, Lydia explores landscape through the materiality of human experience, and she's going to be talking about enduring earth.
Last one. Deep breaths. Okay. Hi, everyone. Much of my work over the last 10 years has been within a North Devon landscape within an estuary, exploring on foot and through repetition its erosion and decay as sea levels rise. So coming into the residency, which was an amazing opportunity, I was bringing these ideas, these processes, these observations to a different place. And as Rebecca Solnit says, in different places, different thoughts emerge. My work that emerged here in response to the residency is called For As Long As the Earth Will Endure. And it's a title, but it's much more than a title. The words shaped my thinking. The words came from the first day, our walking tour of King's Lynn with Ivor, and we looked at Hampton Court, which is now owned by the Preservation Trust. For as long as the earth will endure were the words that were told to us, and they stemmed from a kind of contract between a wealthy merchant owner of the place and a person, perhaps a servant, whose role it was to pray for them after their death, for as long as the earth will endure. The words forming a kind of contract connecting one human to another, to a set of deeply held religious beliefs, to a length of planetary time that seemed to assume an eternity, but now all of us in this room find is open to question. The words made me pause to reconsider the contract between intergenerational time and planetary time, human legacy in the now, and my own sense of endurance. for as long as the earth will endure. The words stayed with me and became a question, a statement, a threat, and an omen. They hung in the air above every place that we spent time in during our research week, and they followed me home. I'm interested in human traces within our landscapes and the emotional responses to both our places and the knowledge of the unfolding climate crisis. These words speak to so much, to our troubled relationship with our world, to a sense that humankind are pushing the planet and all who exist within it to the breaking point of its endurance and beyond, and to an intergenerational time frame of extraction and destruction. The actions of generations before us are unfolding around us, just as the actions and the materiality of the here and the now will continue to unfold for generations to come. The walks and the words held a sense of repetition to them, so I started to type them on an old typewriter over and over, to try and test out the weight of the words and to work within my own endurance. Each typed key stamping its mark and embossing onto the surface of paper, much like our human imprint on the earth beneath our feet. How long can the world endure? And what can we as witnesses and actors endure within it? The more you hold and sound and spell a word or a phrase, the more it is unsettled as it gradually untethers itself from its meaning. At the same time in the studio, I was testing a sense of endurance and the physicality of extraction with materials gathered from our research weeks and the many walks together and alone. Earth from collapsing cliffs at Hunstanton, bacterial bog from earth from Dersingham and Lynn Common, fragments of fossilised forest from Holme Beach. The flint knapping workshop with John Lord was an embodied reminder that extraction is violent and a trace is held within our muscle memory. Physically making the flint was hard, it was physical, and there was a destruction within it as shards broke off. And I wanted to work within this space, so my poorly crafted flint tools became grinding tools through which to make earthinks to work with. The scratches and the residues of the grinding process were held within a copper plate placed beneath, as a register of destruction in a small scale. The earth was mixed with seawater, paper that was ready for recycling was submerged within it and left to repeatedly evaporate before being resubmerged. Sometimes this paper was held under copper plates to make residue prints. In this way, the work holds a record of a sense of endurance of these materials and the processes that surround the extraction of salt, the recycling of paper that we witnessed just up the road at Palm Paper, and the processes of decay that connect back to our long human legacy of extraction. The work in the gallery is held within propped windows, old reclaimed windows from a wreck yard. And that's a connection back to the sash facades in King's Lynn, which we learned about on our walking tour. These sash facades, these Georgian fronts, were built on the riches of extractivist trade in Georgian times with medieval places behind them. The height of each window, leaning as it is against the gallery wall, is around 1 metre, and it serves as a marker for the high water flood lines on the cathedral. Their height is also a reminder of expected sea level rises through the 2050 future flood map. They might just give an embodied marker for where sea levels may be, a way to physically measure your body against the line and imagine a world with this much water in this and every place. Visually, there's a nod to the mind-blowing collections we witnessed at the Sedgwick Museum. Fragments are held in place with pins that hold as many stories in the negative space of the missing pieces as they do in the time-worn materials and the textures within their surfaces. The destructive nature of these processes, the submerging and the evaporating, the peeling off of layers, the scratching and scraping and grinding of earth, and the heavy words left me feeling a bit gloomy. So the last work was a counter from the hopeful encounters at Wild Ken Hill. We briefly talked on our tour about positive feedback loops of kinds. I was struck by the scale and the nature of research into compost as a tool of regeneration. I wondered if I could make on a miniature scale some kind of compost tea, and if this compost tea could be held within a portable framework to let things grow in small pockets of space on windowsills or balconies or backyards. a kind of sticking plaster or an offering perhaps to this damaged earth on which we find ourselves carving out an existence. A small-scale experiment is ongoing here. Sheep wool was submerged to become felted in warm bacterial bog waters, mixed with clover and compost, fragments of fossilised forest and iron-rich blackstrap molasses. In this way, I see this work held in a pause in the gallery. It's kind of wintering in King's Lynn. In springtime, these mineral-laden felt rectangles will return to a patch of garden that the last occupants weed-killed to make the perfect lawn, to see if I can grow seeds within them. Food and wildflowers to bring back a tiny bit of biodiversity lost through intergenerational legacies that are unfolding in the here and now. A small-scale attempt at regeneration. As Donna Haraway says, it matters what matters we think to use other matters with. Perhaps compost tea held in felted wool is a matter to think with. She goes on to say, it matters what stories make worlds and what worlds make stories. These processes are for me a mode of thinking with and a mode of storytelling, telling material stories about our world and what it can endure, what we humans take from it and how much, and what we might give back. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Fantastic talks. Such a lot to think about. So I think we're going to have a panel discussion, but we're going to ask the panel members to stay here. And we're also going to invite Harry, and Tim to come up and open to the floor for some questions.
Sorry, Veronica. Thank you. Those were some wonderful talks. I really appreciated listening this morning. And what I'm very interested in this linking of how we describe the world that we live in and the use of words and the link to literature. And it's something that came up in my talk yesterday, and then I can see it repeated again today. And again, and with Nicola's work, the use of images and words and how they shape our world. I was absolutely fascinated about the suffragettes and comics. What a fantastic idea. So I wondered if people could talk about, and also it's Tim as well, as like the way he describes geography. There's a literary element to the way you describe how we live in the world or how we recognise the world. So I think this is something that's come up with a lot of people's work, is how we can describe it and how we can describe a better future, a better way of living, and our place in the world.
I don't know, Tim, if you wanted to respond, where we put that as well, where it goes, and what, those stories, descriptions. No? Do you have a specific question for any of the panel members?
Well, I just wondered if what is important about literature and how others describe the world, or how others describe the future, and how that influences your own work.
Nicola, do you have any comments?
Yeah.
You'll have to move the.
Well, it's just about different ways of storytelling, and NEP, which Harry referred to, has become a film. So it continues and continues. And I think I was chatting with Charlie yesterday about, I think this is where I got this thought from, how. That we really all referenced the dancing metaphor yesterday, and I was thinking when we were at the visit to Wild Ken Hill, Harry told us that farmers who were traditional farmers were coming to visit you. Is that right? And so slowly the stories filter out and people start to join this dance, and I think it's through this storytelling in whatever way.
And of course, at Wild Ken Hill, you have your website. And do you want to say something about how you see your role as an organisation communicating?
Well, I think really we really do feel that we should be proselytising what we're doing, and really, I'm a fraud because, well, Ken Hill is run entirely by my 32-year-old son, so he is very active on social media and has developed quite a significant following, so that's important. I think generally speaking, philosophically, we have a sort of quite a Buddhist inclusive philosophy about how we are all connected and how what we're doing should be just something that anyone can access, and that includes our fellow farmers. So, yeah.
Fantastic. Tim, you wanted to... Hang on. I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to through there.
Thank you. I think I'm responding really to what Kelly said a little while ago. One thing that's clear here is that everybody is in a dialogue with the natural world and the human world. And something that I feel very strongly is that nature is a text. Now, I'm not privileging literature and writing, but what's so happened here so much has been people building relationship with certain cues in their environment, be it a molehill or some bog water or what have you. But for me, the soil is another text that we can read, and we could say that Harry's work has been about conjuring forces which have been latent in the soil, which has been abused from the point of view of its bioregeneration. It's become a kind of mineral medium, and where I come from in mid Suffolk, so much of the clay and the sand it's become depauperate. It's become impoverished through lack of compost and living things, the bacteria and the fungi, which have been so important, which Harry's alchemy is conjuring. And it's an ongoing project because we don't quite know what its potential is to regenerate wider areas. You know, it may apply in sandy lands in northwest Norfolk. Does it work on the clay lands? You know, or does it end up leading to masses of black grass and cleavers and other things? But I think there's a general point there about nature as text, which I think is very important.
Thank you. Did we have another question? Here we go.
Hi, thank you. I'm very much in awe of the articulateness of so many people here, and my thoughts are perhaps not as clear as that, but one of the things I was thinking about was how we get to talk to people beyond this community, and which Nicola was talking about. Veronica was talking about earlier, and there were a couple of things. One was thinking about how the people who've spoken this morning seem to me they're what Tim Ingold refers to as correspondence. Their art practice is about an interaction, a dialogue between themselves and the material. And so they're listening as much as speaking. And that seems to be quite an important thing. The other was Sarah using the chalk as a mould and filling it up with slip. And it reminded me of the police, using plaster in footprints in those 1950 films. And perhaps rather than talking about it as art, talking about it as evidence. And that perhaps we need to think about the language we use in order to get to other people. and that perhaps we need to stop using words like art, which kind of create barriers, and perhaps think about other ways of talking about what we do in order to get beyond the noticeably very white and perhaps, if I'm arrogantly saying, middle-class group of people that we appear to be here. Thank you.
If I may, I'd like to just respond with my own thoughts to your first question about how do we have impact and how do we... Well, personally, I think we have to try in every way possible. So we try through, you know, the visceral experience that somebody has in a gallery to an object, and then where they might take that. You try through writing, you try through... We're talking within your own bubble, you try and go out of your bubble. So it's the one would, but of course there's only so much energy, and so one needs to prioritize and work out how the most impact that you can have, and how as individuals where we can put our best selves, if you like. So we're not all good at doing everything, so we have to work out what we're good at and work with other people to make that a greater impact. But that's my... And does anyone... John?
Sorry, I just want to echo, I mean, my question is, where is the diversity? You know, that's... Nobody actually answered that question. Where is it? That's my... Do you mean within this group of people here, or whatever within this? This is a good place to start. This is a good place to start. So how do we make this forum more diverse? Any answers?
Invite people in.
It partly depends on your definition of diversity. I think it probably is more diverse here than it looks on the surface, for a start, and that there are people of many different origins here. They may not be showing it openly. It's like when you read in transport, not all disabilities are visible. But that's one thing. But it's a question of of inviting people, and if they're not coming naturally, making a bigger effort somehow.
But how does that happen?
Well, you can answer as much as anything.
I just thought the point you made at the beginning, I think it was your point about culture and society, or maybe it was Helen's, I can't remember. Might have been Bridget's. Anyway, somebody talked about culture as not being an add-on. And she had that, I think it was Bridget, she had the diagram where society was one of the thirds. And maybe instead of society, we need to say culture, and use culture as a wider term that incorporates people and the way we live. And that maybe that's a way of incorporating that into the thought process about how we then go forward and respond to a cultural change, but that includes everybody. And what Nicola was talking about with your graphic comic, I think is a brilliant access point, because it brings in everybody. And it's not scary. It includes everybody's hobby, reference point, upbringing, and that's culture. Culture isn't the theatre and the gallery. Culture is football, it's different clubs, it's different ways you spend your time. That's culture, and that is society too. And is that society too? So I think that's maybe an interesting thing to think about.
Sort of going back to stop banging on about Grimes Graves, but last time I was there for an event, the organisers of the event were collecting money to pay for transport from very local people to visit the site. Brandon is only a few minutes drive from Grimes Graves, but hardly any of the school children have been there. Hardly any of the people that live in Brandon itself engage with the site. And they were kind of essentially just providing a means of transport, a means of kind of opening it up to people. Kind of Brandon's kind of like a post, there's a lot of sort of London expansion, overspill. There's been a lot of social change in Brandon since the war. And there's this real kind of diverse mix of cultures, of economies, of different types of people. And if somewhere sort of somewhere as amazing as Grimes Graves isn't accessible by people and children and local people that live a couple of minutes away, then it's those kind of small steps of providing a means of people kind of coming into contact with these places and these ideas that can really change their minds and change their sort of outlook on these things. So it can, maybe just be a really small step, but done kind of over and over again.
Can I just say, I think it's also about just trying lots of different things. So, I mean, Veronica's work with the gallery is amazing. It was really interesting to hear you say about different people coming in who may have never stepped inside a gallery. It's a really intimidating thing, isn't it, to step in a gallery? Like, I remember going as a kid with my dad who'd never been in a gallery, and he just laughed at everything. He couldn't engage with it at all. He left school at 16. He was like, this is not my world. He still doesn't speak to me about anything that I make. It's not his world. So I think that is one thing. I think another thing is getting people to places, but also going to the places where people are. And I was lucky enough to be funded this year to do a series of walking workshops in local communities where we were literally like getting into the mud and making earthings and walking and chatting together. And so many people came because they were free, because they were like 2 minutes from where they lived. And it was really fabulous actually to hear how many people loved making, like they could remember making at school, but they hadn't made anything for years and years. And people were saying, like, oh my God, I remember this. Like, I love this. How have I lost this part of my identity? And so I think, it feels like it's an extension of our practice and our practices in our studios. We're always trying things. Loads of things fail. 8 things fail, 2 things might kind of work and they stick, but we have to keep trying, I think.
Thank you. Yes, sorry. Of course you can.
I want to pick up again this thing about diversity, because I suspect what you might be talking about, John, is people of colour.
No, can I correct you? I'm not...
Oh, okay. But anyway, I want to pick up on that in that way. Sorry.
Yeah, that's not what I'm talking about.
Right.
I feel it's a bit disingenuous. You should accuse me of that.
Oh, it's not an accusation.
But it's just this idea of talking about how to engage with people. And I think as a generality, I would think I can't see many young people here, for instance, just as an instance. And in terms of talking about activism, where the sort of demographic that are actually more active, that are actually visibly engaging with this issue within society, they are young people. They're younger people. So just looking at diversity under that heading is a place that could be an interesting place to start, for instance.
I'm wanting to respond to that because I'm 72 now, and I spent a lot of my time when I was at Art College in the mid-70s working on trying to reuse materials, not use power tools, because I thought I wouldn't be able to afford power tools once I left, that we needed to go back to things which were manageable for everybody of any caste and any culture and any financial ability. Those things were kind of quite fresh and vibrant for me then. And I did go and camp at Greenman and do all those places. I can't do that now. I'm not physically able. I haven't got the energy. I think it's wonderful that younger people are more activists. But there are many people of all generations, and it tends to be much younger people and older people who are engaged in different ways. People in the middle are very busy bringing up their own children in the best way they can, and I think that's terrific too. So there's a diversity in our approaches, which isn't right or wrong. It's just different at different stages of our life.
and I'm going to give Carolyn as a diversity consultant. So.
Hello. I also live in Lynn, round the corner, and support Veronica at the gallery however I can. This is an ongoing topic with Veronica since the beginning of the gallery. And I just wanted to think about things that came up yesterday in the morning. Sorry, I couldn't be there in the afternoon. Just about identity and fluidity. And I think it was James saying, queering his thinking. My background's in feminism and social anthropology and sexuality and rights. And a lot of work of feminism is to undo identities and think about when you're trying to promote social change or environmental change for that matter, identity politics often ends up stuck and blocking progress. And what occurs to me is, if we think about art or about environmental activism, what is Stonewall saying? What are LGBT rights groups saying about the future of the planet? What's Black Lives Matter saying about the future of the planet? Are we talking to each other, these movements and identity-based groups? And could we do a lot more? Because I think what we've got in all these social movements is people of different generations and different backgrounds, but there's still a tendency for Black Lives Matter to focus on race and racism around the world, and in the UK they'll focus on the UK. For feminism to focus on women's and girls' rights and gender equality, for the LGBT movement to focus on sexuality rights, the right to marry, to have children, whatever, non-discrimination. We tend to still work in boxes. And perhaps one way to think as a way forward is to think, how can we as environmental activists and artists build bridges with other social movements and because to be honest, every single social movement working on identity-based issues needs to think about, will we still be here in 70 years' time? What's the point in fighting for gay rights or women's rights if the society is going to be collapsing and we're going to burn up? So I think the future of the planet is relevant to every single social movement and every single identity-based politics. It's something that unites them all. Just as is a concept of social justice, you can't have a healthy society if you just have women's equality, if it's still a racist, homophobic, etc. So how can we build bridges and dialogue and involve other social movements in the issues we're debating here? To finalise, I do remember historically the miners' strike and the LGBT movement joining forces, and the poor miners being like, oh my goodness, all these gay men and lesbians coming to help us, what do we do with them? But of course, in the end, they built up strong relationships and a strong alliance that benefited both sides. And I think we need to keep building the communication between all these identity-based movements and about the future of the planet.
It's fantastic to see so many people wanting to talk, but we are at a point where we need to move on. And I think we can continue these conversations in our groups, and also we will have another opportunity, I think, Veronica, later to have a group. Oh. Well, it's up. Do we? Okay, right. So I think we had, I didn't count. We had some here, and then I'll come to you. So, you're next to me. Yeah, so 1, 2, 3, 4. Of course. Sure. We're not going to ask your age.
Okay, the microphone's been handed to me. I am not claiming youth. Yeah, I was just interested to kind of further this discussion about the inclusion of a more diverse set of responses to ecological themes around the arts, and particularly thinking about how artists of colour might be providing some different perspectives on some of the themes that we've been discussing today, and how there are different mechanisms. One of the questions was, well, how might we do that? And I've been involved in some positive action interventions, I guess, in work that I do at the University of Leicester. And so just thinking about whether for the next round of these residencies, whether there might be an opportunity to specifically ask for interest from artists of colour or people who've perhaps not been represented in that way, and that could be a kind of quite practical way of sort of diversifying the art and the sort of ways of approaching these themes, which are important to, as we know, to every single one of us.
That's great, thank you. I'm going to move, try and be fair as best we can.
Thank you. I would say as well that everybody needs to be politically engaged. I had to get here early because I was attending a regional trade union council meeting, and I would urge everybody to join, either join a trade union or engage with trade unions as well, because that is a way of mobilising people and for people to understand the strength that they have when they stand together on issues, and to do that inclusively. I've also brought with me today a magazine called Dope Magazine, which I've left a copy downstairs if people want to have a look at that as well. And that's another way that the arts are contributing to people in society and enabling them to bring themselves out of homelessness and to become more active in society.
Context. I don't know if people know of the Land Workers Alliance. It's like the trade union for people who work on the land or are interested. So that's a way of actually getting to a really wide group of people nationally. But
Thanks. Thank you very much for your very important intervention. I just wanted to add to that. It's not just the case that other social movements need to integrate with environmentalism so they have a future. It's also the case that they all share the same roots, the same drivers, the same causes, and it's one that links directly back to the theme of this conference. It's the mindset of extraction and exploitation, and it underlies all our issues, not just the environmental issues we have, but colonialism, patriarchy, ableism, sexism. All of these come from this same mindset of, we talked about it yesterday, that the canalization of rivers, this masculine control of things. It underlies all our social issues, and that's just why intersectional approaches to this are really not just ethically necessary, but pragmatically necessary.
Thank you. I think this lady here was.
Going in response to what you said, John, about diversity, and I think diversity extends just beyond race, just beyond, identity, various kinds of identity. And when it comes to us all just being human, I think art has the potential, it is something that we can harness to educate and include people. And, going back to what Nicola Streeton said, you said about entertain, educate, empower. And I think that is something that arts can do, and I feel workshops or providing people a tangible experience, no matter what background they are from, giving them that that ability to experience something. I think workshops could be the answer, and it can be from as simple as artists addressing, combining interdisciplinary ecological work, scientific work, as simple as teaching someone how to make ink from something and from nature. And that in itself, that simple workshop will provide you an inlet into foraging, into mindfulness, into science, into ecology. So I think we must, harness the potential that arts has. And just one more thing, in relevance to what Harry Buskell said about, I don't know if it fits in, but again, engaging community or engaging people. I just want to give you a very positive example of an agroecological farm in Cambridge, one of the first, I don't know if anybody knows, called Co-Farm. And I had the opportunity to visit the farm. And it is a farm, just being there, their vision, it's so beautiful. It's to bring people together, and they're all volunteers who run the place, and they grow food and they give it to people who can't afford it. Now, that's not art, per se, but it is a creative practice, and it's bringing people from very diverse backgrounds, giving them a physical, embodied, tangible experience, and then changing and shifting mindsets. And I think we need little pockets of that. I think maybe Groundworks is a creative example, something similar to what is being done there. But yeah, I think engaging physically with people is the answer, I think.
Thank you. Was there just a comment, though, to get back to the first thing I started talking about was fragmentation. We have fragmentation in land, wildlife, which is really unhelpful because you cannot have proper diversity in tiny little pockets, and similarly in activism. And we have to find and get better at joining up. But I totally agree with you. You have to start and then it grows. But we also have to do that next step, I think.
Thank you. Thanks to everybody for your presentations. I found that really exciting. I've got a question for all of the artists, and it's a bit of a selfish question because it relates to my own research. But I'm really interested in working on the land and working with the land as a practitioner. And I'm interested in those direct experiences and encounters with the landscape in the different ways that you've talked about. And I'm wondering if that has changed, if those interactions with different elements of the landscape have changed the way that you think or feel about yourself as a human being, as a woman, and also as a subject. So thinking about kind of subjectivity, and if there's anything that you could maybe share about that. Yeah.
Does anyone? Yeah. Julia, could you use?
Sorry. So just give a sub question from that again. Just a small. I'm better at small bits.
Maybe talk a bit about your encounters with the landscape and what you've taken from it personally.
Well, for me personally, as I mentioned, I grew up on a farm, so and I've seen lots of changes through that time, which I don't feel very happy about. And I think that has affected the way I look at the land and find this found object things is because of that, finding things that are contaminating the soil. It's the people that work the land where I live are not the same as the people that worked it 50 years ago. It's a different relationship I'm seeing in the people that work the land, not everywhere, but I'm talking about my personal experience. The people that work it now do not love it. The people that worked it 50 years ago loved it, and I can feel that difference, and that upsets me. And I think that's why I feel so passionate about it. There's a difference in the way people feel about the land. So that's one small contribution.
Sit down.
Build on that. I do a lot of walking as part of my practice, which I didn't have time in the 10 minutes to outline. And one of the reasons I do that is because I feel I do quite specific research in the landscape, and it's quite hard to share that work, and it can be quite, for all the reasons we've talked about, it can be quite elitist in a gallery context, or, you know, sometimes do shows that are quite temporary, so people don't get to see them. And I found that by leading members of the public, and they're open to, I make walks that are open to anyone, they're free, and people come along. And what I'm frequently shocked by is a lot of the people are local. So, for example, I did one in Canterbury the other week, which I think is quite, you know, most of the people lived around Canterbury, and I had devised this walk that went up into the landscape and took them around sites and talked about how the research impacted. No one on the walk knew the sites I took them to at all. So it's also about people learning to discover their own locality and take ownership of it and have a passion for it. And I do wonder if some of it is to do with, you know, I've lived in the same place for a long time, so I'm very familiar with my landscape and I walk it a lot. But, you know, we now have sort of communities which are much more transient. So, you know, my studio's in Margate, even with the artist community, people come for you and then go. You know, so people don't have that same relationship with place. It's not you live in one place all your life. People move around a lot. So I do wonder if that's another factor, is this sort of trying to kind of really give value to the locale you live in and sort of understand it and sort of find these spots within it that you then sort of learn to care about. So I think, you know, I hope I've shown people places that they'll return to and then sort of look out for and sort of respect. But it's really difficult.
Going back to what you were saying about how the place or the landscape or the observations might change you, I think with walking, I think the slow nature of it and the repetition means that, I mean, we're just like running, all of us, I think, at like headlong speed in this sort of mad, it's like we're on a train and we can't get off at the moment. And I think it's obviously a privilege to take 5 minutes out of time into a different time, which is like a slow, repetitive time. But I think the value of that is so profound, and that's what, like, in workshops we do, like crazy slow walking and listening and feeling. There's something in that. But the biggest thing that I think has changed my relationship, particularly with North Devon, is that I had 2 children over the 10 years that I was walking there, and watching them grow up in that place, thinking about their heights and the sea level rises and the poignancy of that, and the fact that that landscape, like some of this landscape, will be gone in their lifetime. So what remains, what records remain? But also watching how playful, I mean, I spoke in quite heavy terms, but actually how playful they are. Like, they engage in a place and a walk in a whole different way. And that's really inspired me, and that's massively come into my practice. And I didn't touch on that, but a lot of what I make is really Heath Robinson and playful. You know, you watch kids picking up sticks and banging things and crawling on the ground and asking questions of everything. Like, I ended up working with plastics and collecting plastics because my daughter said, well, how is this here? How can we leave this here? Well, the answer is we can't. So I think, but like an extension of that is us learning from each other and from creatures and processes and all of that.
Sorry, Lydia, it's exactly when you walk with the communities, there's the solidarity and companionship of walking with someone else, someone you haven't met before, because they develop their own rhythms. So you're sort of changing groups, a bit like we've changed tables here. You meet new people, you share narratives and anecdotes. So kind of selfishly, I found it's also a way that I can learn about the landscape through other people's eyes and learn things that, you know, about the land 50 years ago that I wouldn't have known otherwise. So I think walking is a really interesting way of sort of sharing a relationship.
Did anyone else from the panel want to answer?
There's been a dislocation, a distancing, a separation of people, all kinds of people from the land over the last half century. People don't have that hands-on connection, the getting the soil under their fingers. People who do allotments do, but you know, I think overall there's this separation from the land, and if we can get people back loving it and relating to it and understanding it and feeling it again, that might help.
Sorry. Personally for me, which is moving to Norfolk and living in more land on a domestic scale and opening our home to residencies, it makes me think about the history and the stories behind it. So it's made me look into things and the words that we use and wilderness and this and that. But also it's made me reflect that a lot of radical experimental communities, education systems, Steiner, all that, engage with the land. And I think it's an essential just a thought came to mind.
I just, everything I was talking about was my walks with Russell, discovering more and more about the chalk streams yesterday. Basically, I could feel his empathy with the landscape that he grew up in, something that he loved, and he was just, he's just this. He's just an amazing human being who loves Norfolk, and he's a businessman, and you wouldn't expect this man to have such empathy with the land. And it's when I walked with him, and he was getting really excited about trout and finding trout, and I wanted to find the trout with him too, but we couldn't find the trout because the conditions weren't correct for the trout. And then when we encountered where the land had been destroyed, he physically sort of, and you could feel his emotion, how he was emotionally connected with the land himself. And I think everything that we've learned that I learned through walking with other people and their relationship and their knowledge of the land, with Tim, with Harry, it's like a real empathy. So I'm learning as much from the people who know the land more than I do, and what they're showing me, and how I feel for them and how they feel for the land. And that to me has been a massive learning curve in terms of my response to what I made when I came here, is actually learning about their responses to the land.
Thank you, Catherine. Do you want, it's easier, then we'll come to you.
To connect in with what everyone's been talking about, just to let you know, there is a walk next Saturday that myself and Tim Fisher from Norfolk Rivers Trust will be leading from the gallery, following some of the rivers through town, supporting people to pay attention to their sensory and their emotional responses to the rivers, and to record those in creative ways. And there's a link for you to find out more information and to book via the events page of the Groundwork Gallery website.
Good plug.
I just think those 2 points that have just been made actually come back to that point about culture, and the culture of going for a walk, other than to get to the car, to the bus, to take the dog out for a very slow walk, as a dog walks generally. That idea of it's quite weird to leave your house. I mean, I don't think this, but I think there is a kind of look of it's quite odd to go for a walk. Why would you do that? And we all go for walks because we visually engage with what we're seeing. My husband goes for a walk not to do that. He goes to listen to birds, and he gets very excited and engaged with, another, whatever, blackbird, great tip, whatever it is. And that excitement is something that he does through birds, and he will go and seek out those wastelands because he knows they'll be great for it. But it's not something that people do easily without another reason for going. And I think it's, again, John's point about diversity. There is other things influencing, noticing nature. Nobody on University Challenge ever gets the bird questions right. Well, maybe you do, yeah. But, and it's a cultural thing. So that's maybe something to think about as well.
When Tamlin and I went and visited the big chalk quarry near Norwich at Needham Chalks, we kind of went with this kind of sense of kind of trepidation of how vast and commercial it was going to be. And then, it was. There's no getting away from it. But then we were kind of met by this kind of amazing, passionate husband and wife team who, members of their family are in the flint industry. And this passion that they had for the material and this kind of respect for working it. But to get there and find a woman doing the flint knapping, making these kind of flint squares was kind of such an amazing, brilliant surprise. And she was fantastic. Maxine Hunt, she's amazing. But then when I was looking at the historical record for the Brandon flint industry, the post-medieval gun flint industry, there were women that came up in the research for actually doing the mining, and also sort of actually the flint nappers. So there's this kind of, it's always seen as a very male activity, a male industry, a male kind of dominated landscape, but there are these kind of female, not quite pioneers, I'm not sure if I'll go that far, but that was a really wonderful and like really intimate sort of connection that I wasn't really expecting from the project. So yeah, thank you for that question. I hadn't thought about that.
Lovely to listen to everyone and reflect a little bit more on what we're grappling with today. Something else that occurs to me in the world of art and environment is the contributions they both make to enhancing mental health and well-being, and how much in the pandemic that came to the fore, and how desperate people were to get out into nature, out into the countryside or by the sea. And also explorations of creating a better world in terms of neurodiversity. And I think there's really interesting work going on at UCL in the Bartlett School of Architecture about designing urban design for promoting well-being for people with neurodiverse conditions. A lot of that is around quieter and greener spaces. And I think perhaps we need to be more conscious, just as we're being it's very important that we reflect on diversity and limitations to diversity in our space and our work, that we actually reflect on questions of mental health and how crucial art and the environment and nature are to enhancing both. And if we think about everyone in Britain who experiences inequality and discrimination, has a dramatic effect on people's mental health. It's not possible to be discriminated against and just be completely happy with the world. And, therapy, psychoanalysis, it can be expensive. It's not very available on the NHS. I can say perhaps historically women have engaged with psychotherapy and counselling perhaps more than men. Maybe we've had to, but I think that there are other ways we can engage with different sectors of society and bring forward the need to preserve nature and ecology and biodiversity, linking up with questions of mental health and being perhaps a little bit more specific about how important the work everyone is doing is for people to cope mentally with the world as well.
Yeah, just picking up on the last point. I know that Veronica's worked with the Restoration Trust, and they work with mental health in Norfolk. And I've also done work with Art Branches, which is based in Bury St Edmunds. And we've been doing workshops out. We did some during the windows during lockdown for children who are young carers, who are stuck at home in one way or another or restricted in that. And we've also worked with refugee children from all sorts of different backgrounds, but quite a lot of them don't speak English at all. We've also worked with people recovering from mental health problems. And the aim of Art Branch is to work out the interface between art and the environment. And I'm sure, starting really from what John's point about diversity, I'm sure that there are all sorts of ways, and picking up what Bridget said, first of all, that a wonderful presentation, first of all, picking up what we can do to actually run our own outreach events and democratise our practice. And in whatever way suits you, whatever way you can run with, but to make that radical move, radical because it's referring to roots and the rootedness of everything that we do in each other, sort of intersubjectively, and also, of course, in the environment as well.
I'll just respond to your intervention briefly. I recently went to a talk about the mental health of farmers and the terrible state that it's in. I can't remember the statistics, but they were truly, truly shocking. So I think it's interesting to reflect that it's not just being in the country in itself is not enough to make people feel okay. They feel isolated, unheard, poor, so it's about how these things happen that is really, really important. And there's a lot to say in that area, of course, and that's slightly off the point, but I think it's worth, reflecting that it's just being in the countryside in itself is not necessarily enough.
University of Derby has done some very valuable work on the actual therapeutic value of engaging with the environment. And it's not just going for a walk, it's actually focusing on things. So the art of interrogating molehills or the art of discovering lichens with a magnifying glass can take people out of themselves, and acts as a sort of yeast in their own regeneration and happiness.
Absolutely.
It's a small point, but I thought we ought to point out that Bridget isn't here today because she's in Norwich with Norfolk Wildlife Trust at the Arts Centre doing a drop-in session for specifically for young people to get involved in nature and activism. And it is a drop-in session, so people don't have to commit to a whole morning. And there's an area there, a quiet area for people with neurodiverse issues who don't want to be in a big crowded conference. So it's happening right now.
Sorry, this is going slightly sort of away from the topic that we were, but coming back perhaps to the climate change issues that we sort of started the conference with. And it might be a little bit specific and a little bit selfish to ask, but Harry, can I just ask, you are farming in a very, very difficult and fragile part of the coast. How do you look to the future and protecting your farm and your land?
I'm going to answer the question and then leave. Sorry. I think our general approach really is you have to work with nature, not against it. And that's the place we need to get to. So if we have sea inundation, then that's what we're going to get. And there's not that much point trying to stop it. But what we will get is a sea marsh instead of a freshwater marsh. So we'll have different species. And saltwater marsh actually stores masses of carbon. And so that's just an example. So I think we need to be a bit more pragmatic about it, I think is probably the answer. Thanks. I'm really sorry, but I've got to go.
This is a plug for graphic comic novel, graphic comics. I recently read a book. I was talking to Lizzie earlier about the kind of books that we've read, and maybe there's a kind of need for a book list being put together that we're all recommending. But this was a graphic exploration of trauma, which is obviously something that I'm very interested in my work. And there was a connection with experiencing creativity as a healing tool for human discomfort at all levels of trauma, whether it's anxiety, day-to-day, or bigger PTSD. But creativity is a way of working things through, and the engagement with nature that Tim was talking about is another part of that. And if we come back to education, education is a way of introducing creativity to people's lives, and that is what Bridget's doing today. But also it's something that the creativity is disappearing, has disappeared, that flexibility out of the curriculum, and maybe we need to be targeting schools and education with our, as a way of engaging with groups, and the walks that happen are great, but maybe there needs to be a task force heading to all young people where they can't escape, and they engage with it, in education, a kind of because it's an amazing thing to offer. So that was the point. And the book I'll put a photograph of the book on the WhatsApp.
This is just a question really to everyone in the room who's part of the network, just to raise your hand if you are actually engaged in doing work in mental health kind of projects, or working with refugees and asylum seekers, or in education, because I get a feeling that there probably is a lot of people here already doing the stuff. Okay, thanks.
Do you want all our names? Are we ready downstairs? I just a very few words trying to summarise where we've got with this discussion. I mean, for me, the things that have come through are we're fucking doing it. We are doing it. We're doing what we can. We're doing projects and workshops, as you were saying, and they're really, really important. And but for me, it's also about a broader impact. And I hate the need to measure things all the time, but there is a sort of, in a sense, I'm really tied to the idea of evidence and knowing what's happening from those interventions. So I'm and the way in which while Ken Hill are working, they're working on an evidence-based, sort of relationship with the land, and I do wonder about how we can explore sort of working out what works, if you like, and what, because we do only have so much energy, and we need to do our own stuff, and we need to earn money, and we need to look after children, and we need to do all those other stuff. So, so impact. How do we know what impact we're having and where we're having it is sort of really important for me. And diversity is absolutely key in that, in all its forms. So I'm going to hand that to you.
I don't know. I'd like to thank you, Helen, for chairing this so well. And to thank all of you, because we do always, we can never ever be complacent about where we've got to or who we are or how we're engaged. We've always got to be trying harder, and thank you for those prompts to try harder and push in all different directions, because between us we will do it, but we can't any of us do it by ourselves. That's really the point of the network, and I'm very well aware that it is just a beginning. We've got to pull more and more and more people, make it a bigger. One network will form another, and we link them all up, hopefully, and then we'll get our social. It's Charlie. Do you want to say something about?
Yeah, this voicing actually. So I was hoping that we might see a tidal bore today, but we won't. Essentially, it's about now when the tide changes, but you don't actually see it visibly until the river narrows a bit further upstream.
But it apparently does really roll down the river sometimes.
Yeah, it's a full-on tidal wave.
If you want to be distracted by looking out of the window, just look out and see if you like. Anyway, thank you. And once again, thanks to Henry. thanks to Olia downstairs, who's been cooking away, and thanks to Jack in the corner there, who is my son who provided the ladybird image yesterday. And when I texted him yesterday to say we've run out of food, he rushed out, bought food, and has cooked for us too. And he is young. And he's doing a PhD. Well, he'll tell you. Go and ask him.